Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Talking History Online, our second session for 2021. Tonight we've got a great lineup for you. We're looking at history and fiction writing and going down the rabbit hole. Before we go any further, though, I'd like to acknowledge that tonight, this land that we're broadcasting to you from is the land of the Kaurna people. That I'm personally coming to you from Kaurna land, as is our tech team behind the scenes. That the History Trust of South Australia respects the primary place of Aboriginal people in the history of this place. We acknowledge that our story commenced long before Governor Hindmarsh proclaimed the new province of South Australia and established colonial government in 1836. We also acknowledge that Aboriginal people have a long history that extends millennia into the past. Aboriginal land and sovereignty were not recognised in 1836, and we acknowledge again that building a shared understanding of our history is crucial to reconciliation and creating a positive future for all of us here in South Australia. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Christy Kokigi. I'm the Director of Public Engagement at the History Trust of South Australia, and it's always my great pleasure to welcome you to Talking History Online. Tonight's topic, as I said, it's about fiction and history writing. So fiction often draws on real events and people to inspire their stories, and many writers do undertake extensive historical research as part of their craft. That's a given. And a story about the past can really be made to come alive with those small historical details that immerse us in a time that's before our own time. And you know, I notice it with my own kids when they're reading historical fiction. It just takes on this really special experience for them. And so, you know, you often wonder, where does history stop and fiction begin? And what is it about the past that makes it such a good setting for spinning these stories and these new narratives? So tonight, to talk on this topic, I'm going to introduce you our panel of writers. We have joining us tonight Pip Williams, Victoria Purman, and Emma Ashmere. So first of all, I'm going to introduce Pip. So Pip was born in London, grew up in Sydney, I believe, but calls the Adelaide Hills home now. And she's co-authored the book Time Bomb, Work, Rest and Play in Australia Today. And in 2017, she wrote One Italian Summer, a memoir of her family's travels in search of the good life, which was published by Affirm Press to wide acclaim. Pip has published extensively, from travel articles to book reviews to flash fiction, which it sounds very interesting, and poetry. And many of you would know her for her debut novel, the Dictionary of Lost Words, where she really does combine that talent for historical writing with this immersive, beautiful storytelling. So I am going with that. I'm going to hand over to Pip to talk to us about historical research and fiction writing.
Thank you very much, Christy, and thank you to everyone who's joining us tonight, and of course to the History Trust of South Australia for hosting this really wonderful event. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the Adelaide Hills, which is Paramount country, and I acknowledge to the Kaurna people, because I wrote this book, the Dictionary of Lost Words, on both those lands, Kaurna and Paramount country. And I'd particularly like to acknowledge that for these mobs, the language that they spoke for millennia very quickly was taken away from them. And this book is all about words and what words mean and how words define us. And I'm acutely aware that the words that have been lost from Aboriginal people around Australia, that in itself has affected their connection to each other, to land, to history, to culture, and many of those languages are being found and renewed and regenerated, and that is part, I think, of reconciliation, our combined effort to resurrect these languages and words that have been lost. And so that's a heartfelt acknowledgement. And I thought what I might do before launching in to where history ends and fiction begins, I thought what I'd do is just read a very, very short part from near the beginning of my book. And then I'll explain what the book is about. April 1891. It had been 3 years since the picnic to celebrate A and B, but they were still working on the proofs for C. The page had been typeset, but some of the lines had been ruled out, and the margins were messy with Da's corrections. Where he'd run out of room, he'd pinned a scrap of paper to the edge and written on that. "I like the new one," I said, pointing to the scrap of paper. "What does it say?" "To certify ye this thingy, send ye for the damsel, and then shall ye know by her owny mouthy." "Why do you like it?" "It sounds funny, like the man who wrote it couldn't spell and was making up some of the words." "It's just old," Da said, taking back the proof and reading what he'd written. "Words change over time, you see. The way they look, the way they sound, sometimes even their meaning changes. They have their own history." Da ran his finger under the sentence. If you took away some of the E's, this would almost be modern." "What's a damsel?" "It's a young woman." "Am I a damsel?" He looked at me, and the tiniest frown twitched his eyebrows. "I'll be 10 next birthday," I said, hopeful. "10, you say? Well, that settles it. You will be a damsel in no time." "And will the words keep changing?" The spoon stopped midway to his mouth. "It's possible, I suppose, that once the meaning is written down, it will become fixed." "So you and Dr. Murray could make the words mean whatever you want them to mean, and we'll all have to use them that way forever." "Of course not. Our job is to find consensus. We search through books to see how a word is used. Then we come up with meanings that make sense of them all. It's quite scientific, actually." "What does that mean?" "Consensus? Well, it means everyone agrees." "Do you ask everyone?" "No, clever boots, but I doubt a book's been written that we haven't consulted." "And who writes the books?" I asked. So in a way, that is where this story started. The little girl in that section is called Esme, and Esme is the daughter of one of the lexicographers who helped with the compilation of the Oxford English Dictionary. And I was interested to know whether words mean different things to men and women. And if they do, is it possible that we've actually lost some words and the meaning of some words in the effort to compile them? And the reason I ask these questions is because I realised that the Oxford English Dictionary was a very Victorian era endeavour. I read a wonderful book called The Surgeon of Crowthorne by Simon Winchester, which was non-fiction. And it was a very lovely story, interesting story about the editor of the Oxford English Dictionary and one of the people who sent in words with examples of how they were used on little slips of paper. And this is how they came up with the definitions. They collected as many examples of use from every book that they could possibly find, and they'd come up with a definition. And after reading this book, I realised that there were some problems with how the Oxford English Dictionary was compiled way back in the sort of end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And not only were all of the editors men, not only were all of the lexicographers men, everyone who was paying for it was a man. But the most important thing was that a word had to have a textual history to be included in the dictionary. And we're talking about pre-20th century, when literacy was low and most of the books had been written by men. And so when Esme asks, and who writes the books, that in a way is the crux of of my question. That is what I'm concerned with. If our understanding of language comes from the words written by one segment of society, in particular wealthy, well-educated men, are we actually losing something in the effort to define them? And so I suppose when we talk about where does history end and fiction begin, for me, the history ended with what we know. And the fiction began with the question about the gaps, about the things that we don't know. And in my case, what I couldn't find in the history was an answer to those questions. Were words lost? Were women's words lost? Were the words of working class people lost in the effort to define the English language? And when I read more of the history, I realised really what an extraordinary endeavour the Oxford English Dictionary was. Their goal was to actually define every word in the English language that was currently spoken at the time, but also words that were already obsolete. So they wanted to record the history of the language, not just the current use of the language. But in doing that, they had to rely, the only source of data that they had was written text. And if you go back centuries, I mean, not only was literacy low among many groups of people in the 19th century, it was particularly low, even lower, if you go back to the 12th century, which is as far back as I think most, some of the words go. And so, of course, they have missed something. They've missed those words that are spoken in the birthing room and the laundry, down the coal mine, in the field. They've missed these words because the people who were writing the books weren't doing that work. And while some of them might have written books about the working class or about women, and of course there are many women who wrote books, but they are far outnumbered by men. And the women who wrote books were highly educated and came from wealthier families. And so I invented a young woman and I put her under the sorting table in the scriptorium, which was the name of the garden shed in a house in Oxford, James Murray's house. And I basically wrote a fiction. I wrote her story. I wrote about her growing up and interacting with the words in the scriptorium. And I wanted to know how they would affect her and also how she might affect the words. And so that's the story that I've written. And in writing it, I answered those questions for myself. And in writing it, I realised that this history of words, this history of a dictionary, something that has sat on my shelf my entire life, and I have never questioned the authority of it until this idea came into my mind. And what I realise is when you examine history from a fictional point of view, when you ask a question that has never been answered by the history books, and you explore it in a fictional way, you are essentially exploring your contemporary self and your contemporary life and the issues that affect you and your society today. And for this story, I couldn't help but by the time I got to the end, see the parallels between lost women's words back in the 19th century and the lost words of Indigenous people, for instance, or the lost words of working class people still today, or immigrants or refugees. I also can't help but right now, in this moment, and be, I suppose, disappointed that the same questions are arising today. Do words mean different things to men and women? Well, it appears that they do. And are some words more important than others? Well, it appears that they sometimes are. And we've seen that in terms of the he said, she said discussion that's going on in political terms in particular. And so for me, historical fiction is a way to explore the past, understand our present, and see who we want to be in the future. So that's my 10 minutes, I think. Thank you for listening.
Great. Look, thank you so much, Pip. That's really powerful stuff from your acknowledgement of the lands you wrote the book and you're coming to us from, through to, you know, those big questions about who writes the books and who's responsible for these sources and whose words are lost. It's yeah, and that powerful connection with today is really it's a fabulous way to start this discussion. So thank you very much. Now we are going to, and I should mention there's been some really lovely comments in the chat while you're talking, Pip. So I'd encourage you to go and have a look at the chat. Your book and your work has obviously impacted on people's lives. So that's fabulous to know. So thank you. Now I will now introduce Victoria Purman, who's going to speak for 10 to 15 minutes as well. Victoria is a best-selling fiction author, and her book, some of her books, The Land Girls, which was published in 2019, and The Last of the Bonegilla Girls was published in 2018, well, 3 years ago now, but The Last of the Bonegilla Girls was a novel based on her mother's post-war migration to Australia. And I'm told that The Women's Pages was published just in September 2020, so her most recent book. She's a very regular guest at writers' festivals and is no stranger to Adelaide and the Adelaide Festival. So with that, I'm going to introduce Victoria to speak to you now.
Thanks, Christy. I'm trying to technically, I'm trying to start my video, but I think the host has, someone at your end has to start my video.
Okay, well, we'll just get Britt and Catherine onto that.
Here we go. Yeah, here we are. Thanks,
Brilliant.
Christy. Thanks, Christy. Hi, everyone. And look, thank you to the History Trust for inviting me to be part of this session tonight. I would like to acknowledge the lands of the Kaurna people on which I write and live, where my books have been written. I'm going to start with, we will pose 3 questions for this session, and I'm going to start with the last one, which is, what is it about the past that makes it such a good setting for spinning new narratives? A bit like Pip, I'm always fascinated by what's not in the history that we learn and who's missing from that history. This idea for my last few books about, you know, tackling Australian stories and the people that are missing from our history started with, as Christy mentioned, my book, The Last of the Bonegilla Girls. And I'm a first generation Australian. Both my parents are from Europe. And when I looked around for stories about that migrant experience, and I'm talking that 1950s migrant experience, very different now in the 2000s and 2010s. I didn't see that reflected anywhere. I went to school with a host of kids who are like me, first generation Greek, Italian, Yugoslavian, and then I went on to university where those were my contemporaries. And I wanted to know where were the stories of people like me. So that's where The Last of the Bonegilla Girls came from. And what I was so heartened by when I toured with that book was that people, I'd put up my hand and say, in a crowd of 60 people, and say, who's a Bonegilla girl? And hands would go up everywhere. It was like unleashing a part of their history that no one had ever thought was important. And that was for me the power of that book, which reflected that experience. And so that really fired me up, I guess, to tell more of those stories. And that came about purely because I was, as authors do, casting around for an idea. I'd known that name my whole life. My mother was 14 when she came to Australia, with her parents and 4 siblings were at Bonegilla. Now, for those who don't know, it's an ex-army camp. Well, then it was an ex-army camp in Albury-Wodonga, on the banks of near the Hume Weir. And after World War II, it didn't need to be an army base anymore. We didn't need to train troops. So there's lots of accommodation for up to 9,000 people. So in that great post-war migration era, people who were offered supported passage to Australia, assisted passage, were often sent there just to stay, somewhere to live until they could find work. And they went everywhere from Woomera in South Australia up to the cane fields in Queensland. And so 1 in 20 people in Australia have a link to that place, and I'm one. So that really inspired me to start thinking about those sorts of stories. And when I was researching that book, and this is about where ideas come from, I heard about the Australian Women's Land Army, and so I thought, I didn't know we had a land army. I knew that the UK had one in World War I as well, and that those women played a really important part in feeding the UK population during wartime, and troops, because so much was going over to the troops and battlefield. So I started down that rabbit hole, and it is a rabbit hole. Who were these women? What encouraged them to enlist in the Land Army? What experiences did they have? What happened to them after the war? And so that book, I'm not an historian, I should say, actually, at this point. I'm a journalist originally by training, and there's the 5 W's is something drilled into every young journalist: who, what, why, where, when, and then is the how. So I was always asking questions. That was my career, and it helps if you're nosy and inquisitive, I suppose. You're curious, and I like to think of it as curiosity, to ask, who were these people? Why did they do it? Where did they go? What happened to them? And that book became The Land Girls. So I created 4 characters to reflect the history that I researched for those women. And researching the history was wonderful. I found copies of a newsletter organised to be sent to all the participants in the Land Army, for instance, and it was full of contributions from the actual land girls themselves, and that's what they called themselves, the Land Girls. So I was able to get really first-hand kind of stories about what they were doing, and the work they were doing, where they were, their experiences. But that leads to a question, and it's something that I always struggled with. Were they even telling the truth, and did those things reflect the real truth of what their experiences were? I listened to oral history recordings of women which were recorded in the 1980s, and they were asked really brilliant questions by historians about where they'd been and what they'd done. But I think if the questions had been asked today in the context, and Pip mentioned, he said, she said, the Me Too movement, I think we might have had very different questions to those women. And so history can be rubbery, I think, and that's what I found out. Hi, Kendria, thanks so much for your comment. So that's what I find fascinating about researching the past, is who writes it, where are the women, and as Pip mentioned, where are the women in our history? Where do they disappear to? So that's, for all those reasons, history is fascinating to me. Christy, you might want to come on and wave when I hit my 10 minutes. I'm going to go over, I just know it. Research. It's a total rabbit hole for me, and I fall down it very regularly. I'm going to read just a little snippet from my most recent book, The Women's Pages. This is a book that started with the question, what did women do in Australia if they were in the Land Army? What happened to them in World War II? And what happened when the war ended? That was a fascinating bit of history to me. So many men died, so many men were injured, so many women who'd done jobs during the war, vital jobs, suddenly lost their work. Where was their place? What did they struggle with? So that's where the overall idea came from for the Women's Pages. But in terms of research, I'm going to read the first couple of sentences to then explain all the things I had to research just to write the opening. So this is chapter 1, and it begins on a VP Day, or VJ Day as it was called back then, in August 1945. The day the war ended, Tilly Galloway sat at her desk on the second floor of the Daily Herald building in Sydney's Pitt Street and cried with delirious joy. She held a sodden handkerchief in her left hand, smeared with what was left of her foundation and mascara, and a cigarette was gripped tightly between the middle and index fingers of her right, the imprint of her regimental red Helena Rubinstein lipstick like a kiss at the cork tip end. She dragged hard, filling her lungs with heat and smoke, and her blood with the rush that had kept her going for so long now that she couldn't imagine getting through a day without it. When the tears stopped, when her shoulders stopped shaking, she lit another from the butt of her fourth that morning and leant back in her chair, eyes closed, feeling her heart knock against her ribs. The whole bloody thing was really over. Now she's referring to the war, of course. But just for those few sentences, I had to invent a newspaper. I called it the Daily Herald. I didn't want it to either be the Daily Telegraph or the Sydney Morning Herald. My character's in Sydney. So I had to research where the newspaper offices were. And then I had to think about where I wanted her to live in relation to where she worked. Tilly's a reporter at the paper, because public transport petrol was rationed and public transport was crowded during World War II, that part of World War II. So she would have walked to work. And I wanted her to walk to work because I wanted to have that, I wanted to create that journey for my readers about walking through Sydney. So where were the newspapers? I then went to historic photos of where the Sydney Morning Herald building was down at the end of Pitt Street. And that's where I decided to put it. How long would it take to walk from Pitt Street to Potts Point, where I had her live? All those things fed into that first sentence even. And as I was writing this scene, I thought, well, she'd be wearing lipstick. What colour could women buy lipstick in World War II? These are crucial questions. What colour would it be? So that took me to Trove, and historians know about Trove. It's just talk about a rabbit hole. I went to the Women's Weekly magazine of the exact week of the war ending, because this is how important it was for me. And I found a Helena Rubinstein ad with the colours of lipsticks on it. And that's where I got regimental red lipstick. Now, these sound like really small things, but when that name popped out at me, I thought it just is so evocative about a wartime lipstick colour. I had to put it in. So in my commercial fiction world, the history has to be a light touch, but I like to have it as a bedrock underneath the narrative and the story that I create for readers. But little things like that I just found brilliant. Here are some of the other things I've had to research. Were there hot water bottles in 1942? Yes, the rubber ones. Yes, there were. But boy, did that take some time. Most people had those sort of solid copper bed warmers, which they'd put hot coals in, and I found those. I thought they were urinals or something when I've seen them in antique shops. Was French perfume in Australian shops in World War II? The answer was no, because all exports from France stopped, obviously. When were rations introduced, and what did people buy at the shops to take home to cook for dinner? I mean, that was really important. I know, being a child of migrants, when my mum describes coming to Australia in 1954, there was chicken in a basket and a mixed grill with chops. And that was kind of it. So I really had to go back, and I looked at recipes in women's magazines of the time, and I think I came up with meatloaf. Some of the things I'm researching for the book that I'm writing at the moment, which is set in England in World War I, is really basic things like, did people have electric light in their little cottages in a small village in Middlesex? It's a tiny thing, but it colours how I write those scenes about the family gathering together in the evenings. If they had no electric light, reading by lamplight would have been a strain on their eyes. So all those sorts of things I find fascinating. Do I distract myself with them when I'm meant to be writing? Absolutely. But it's just part of the world building for me, which is so important. for the book I'm writing now, as I mentioned, it's set in World War One. No title yet. I can't give it away. I had planned to go there in March last year. Now, of course, everyone knows what happened, and it's a very first world problem. But I'm so envious of Pip, who was able to go to Oxford at least once, I think twice, to walk the streets, and it's so informative. And I haven't been able to go to Harefield, which is the village I'm writing in, and it's been devastating because I just needed to walk around, feel the distances, look at the views, look at the flowers, listen to the birds, all those sorts of things. So I've had to do that via Google and Maps. But that's the bit I love, and I love the research around that stuff. As I said, it's like a bedrock, and too much research and readers find it boring. And look, I'm probably the same. But it helps me create a world, helps me put the characters in that world, and about how they react. So it's a kind of a social history that I need as well as a physical history. And physical locations, which inform everything. It informs each other, I think. I find it fascinating. When I wrote the women's pages, as I mentioned, my character lived in Millers Point as a child, and then moved to Potts Point as a married woman. But I went to Millers Point to walk around because my character Tilly Galloway is the daughter of a wharfie and a stalwart wharfie's wife, and I walked around Millers Point, and it's very fancy now and super expensive. But back in the day, it was full of rented houses owned by the Water Board, the Maritime Board, sorry, and wharfies lived there. So I walked around. There happened to be an open inspection happening in one of the houses on the exact street that I wanted to put her as a child. And I couldn't believe my luck. So of course, I was with my husband, and we walked in, and the real estate agent gave us a brochure and it had a map of the house on it. I mean, I couldn't believe it. So I was able to walk into the house where I had her as a child. And so much of the action takes place in the book with her parents. So it was even the view out of the her bedroom window, and I wrote that in the book. It's just these little things give a flavour, and thanks, Isabel, it was serendipitous. It was just so beautiful to walk around and imagine what that house would have been like during the war. So all those bits of research go into, for me, go into the books I write, and I absolutely love it. Is it frustrating? It's absolutely frustrating. Do I make it harder for myself? Oh, yes. Did you know, for instance, that the term septic tank for yank, for an American, wasn't used during World War II? Who would have thought? It came in much later. So these are the random things I learned from researching my books. But I love everything I do. I love writing them, and the readers who've contacted me have loved them as well. So I'm going to keep doing it. But as Pip will probably agree, and Emma as well, it can drive you to despair sometimes. But yes, that's my process. It's not scientific, really. It's probably very different to an historian, and I do rely on the work of historians when researching. So I want to send a shout out to all of them as well. I think my time might be up.
Yes, look, thank you so much, Victoria. That was lovely, just to get an insight into your process of research. And I know it's not dissimilar to historians, that curiosity and going down the rabbit hole, like you said, and questioning everything, and then you weave in that idea of serendipity and the sense of place, and yeah, you weaved an amazing story there, and just in terms of how you create your stories and your characters and the worlds that they live in. So that is absolutely fabulous.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to introduce our third panelist before we have a bit of a general discussion. Now, Emma, as we said before, we've been having some problems with internet connection, so Emma may keep her video off during this talk. Oh, hi Emma, awesome. Awesome. I was going to put a picture up of you if we couldn't see you, because I don't think it's fair for people to not see your lovely faces at the same time. But we'll see how we go. If Emma has to turn her video off just to make sure that the bandwidth can cope, then that's what's happening. But Emma has a PhD on the use of marginalised histories in fiction, and she also has an MA in creative writing, which I believe you got here in Adelaide, at University of Adelaide, didn't you, Emma? So again, no stranger to Adelaide, but you do live in northern New South Wales. And Emma has published 2 books, The Dreams They Forget, with our very own Adelaide-based Wakefield Press, there we go, in 2020, and The Floating Garden in 2016. Brilliant. Everyone's got their props ready. I love it. So I'm just going to hand straight over to Emma. So we'll hear from Emma, and then we'll have all 3 panelists join us for a bit of a discussion and a Q&A, because there's some very good questions popping up in the Q&A. So thank you, Emma.
Thanks, Christy, and thanks everyone from History Trust for inviting me. I'm speaking to you from Bundjalung country in northern New South Wales, but I was born in Kaurna country and did my MA there. And look, it's been fantastic to hear the other writers. It's lovely to meet them as well. And I was just thinking about what Victoria said, that there's this stage, I think, when you're researching and everything's like iron filings to a magnet. You sort of notice coincidences, little serendipitous moments. There's something in the paper that no one ever has been interested in and you've been reading for 2 months. And that's a really intense phase of research. And I really, I love to think about what is the thing that catches a writer's eye. And they think, well, actually, I'm going to spend a couple of years researching that. And when we write women's histories, we're trying to write women back into history, we often know that the archive will actually be quite bare because we have been left out, and other marginalised groups as well. So I have this sort of almost feverish sensation where I go in, and if I just pick the right book off the shelf or maybe press on the bookshelf, it might just spin around like a sort of Hollywood movie, and I'll end up like this false wall of books and I'll be tossed into another world. And you are, in a way, and Trove is that wonderful rabbit hole, as you call it. It's like a hall of mirrors. You can go down there, and I found this wonderful story about a woman wearing this beautiful emerald green dress, and she's gone to a dance in Adelaide in the 1940s. And so I followed this woman for a while, but the next time her name came up, it wasn't actually her wearing the dress, it was her sister. And then the following week, it was the other sister. So what I could deduce from that emerald green dress, which I had to imagine because it's a black and white photograph, is that these were sisters and they made the dress themselves and they shared it. And it just brings that idea of how people operated in the past in simple domestic ways. But is that enough for me to be interested to write a story and to pursue it? And so this is where the imagination comes in, where you go, well, what if a woman robbed a bank wearing an emerald green chiffon dress? That would start off a whole nother story. I haven't actually written that story, but that's sort of what you do. You sort of toss in a grenade of what if, and then you see what splashes back. And we start with a lot of questions, and then you start to think, for myself anyway, oh, look, I'm getting a handle on this. And so in my short story collection, Dreams They Forgot, I was actually writing a novel that I'm still working on. And I'd been researching Adelaide in the 1800s. And I was sort of toiling away thinking, will I bring my characters back to Adelaide and get them away from a scandal? So I was looking things up like what sort of stone was Parliament House built by, because I want them to walk past there when it's being built. And this sort of voice came in and barged into my afternoon saying, they call me Irish Iris. They say I have eyes everywhere. And I thought, well, you're not in my book. Who are you? And it's a bit like the green chiffon dress woman. Who are you? So I just sat there and I knew enough from writing that when a sort of powerful sentence comes to you, you really have to catch it before it slips away. And I actually ended up writing a short story called Nightfall, which went into the Commonwealth short story shortlist, which is a fabulous short story competition, and wonderful writing comes out of it. And really, it was based on just following this amazing voice, but it is not that miraculous. It's actually about reading and writing and doing the work. And I'd actually just read Catherine Helen Spencer's book, Clara Morrison, which was the first book written by a woman in Australia, set in Adelaide during the gold rush, and all the men have left Adelaide. And basically it's a city of women, and they're doing all the things that men used to do. It's a fascinating book, and she puts in snobbery, kindness, women just trying to make do. And I think it's probably from that setting that I got the idea of the short story. So there's a lot of hard work paddling away underneath. The other thing I'd read was I'd come across an excerpt in the paper where someone dug up floorboards of an old doctor's rooms on North Terrace, and they found some skeletons underneath. And that was popped away in my brain. I'd also been reading about the Destitute Asylum, which I'd walked past for years when I went to university there and didn't really know what it was. And somehow all those things formed into this story called Nightfall. So really, the ideas are everywhere, and it's just about looking for the details. And when I get stuck into writing, it's really about almost like building a set for a film. So you've got to think about these details, and that's one of the questions for tonight. But those details have to be interesting to the reader, but also you've got to realise it's normal. It's normal for a woman to go out and chop the wood and just pick up an axe and to light it in a particular hearth. It's normal to her to do that in the 1800s, but it's maybe not so normal for us. So you're always playing that game about what's interesting to the reader, how much do they have to know, what helps them understand it. And there's this lovely sort of pact between the reader and the writer that we're all in this suspension of disbelief. We know that it's just a story. The writer's making it up. The reader is making it up in their mind. And there's like this sort of strange little movie moving around in my mind as I'm writing. And I'm thinking, can I transmit that movie to you? And will you see it in the same way? And so there's this lovely sort of strange sort of transmission of ideas through words. And so like in a movie set, they'll actually build walls and they'll dot their little ink pots around in their quills, and the camera will pan past it, and you almost want your reader to do that as well. And so we're in this strange situation writing about times we didn't live in, but we can extrapolate from our own experience. And so obviously I didn't ever wait for a mail coach, but I did live on a remote cattle station for a while, and the mail van used to come only twice a week. Or, you know, backpacking in the 80s through Java, an aerogram letter would sort of come to you vaguely across, you know, through volcanoes, and would somehow find you. So, I mean, we know what it is like to be remote, and we're just extrapolating about memory, anecdote, history, fact, and imagination. And I think it's that mix that writers are trying to do and to engage their readers with. I also just want to talk about the idea of when do we research, and for me it's always a dual process. I'll do a lot of reading. I'm a slow writer, so I might forget stuff, so I'll go back again. And there was a short story that I wrote in '99 when I was doing my MA at Adelaide University, and it was called The Second Wave. And it was just written really about a memory of the 1976 tidal wave, so-called, that was supposed to wipe out Adelaide. And I was about 10 or so at the time, and I remember this strange feeling about this tidal wave that was supposed to hit. So I wrote the story about it, and I made a fictional family who were staying at a beach house, a bit like one we used to rent on a cliff in Adelaide Beach. And it was this feeling about what was it like? You know, is it really going to come? Do we believe in it or not? A house painter turned clairvoyant had actually predicted this earthquake and tidal wave. And he said it was going to come because it was going to wipe out the sinners. Now, I didn't really remember that detail. So when I wrote the short story, my brother, who's actually a journalist, sent me some clippings from the 1976. And in there was sort of wacky pictures of people dressing up in their bikinis and snorkels and having sort of anti-tidal wave parties on the CBD roofs. But then it was revealed why the actual prediction was made. And the prediction was because homosexuality had just been decriminalised in South Australia after a long, brutal battle. And so suddenly I realized that beneath this rather frothy, sort of unnerving story was a deadly serious issue that we actually do see rising now and then. The bushfires were attributed to gay marriage recently, that sort of thing. And we come back into that circle of history. And how did I forget that that was there? Or did I not know? Or did I know and not care? And it really is about reclaiming those stories that of marginalised people that somehow get forgotten. And it's really lovely to be able to, yes, Fontella, Don Dunstan did go down to the beach. He went down to Glenelg, and I write about that in the story. And it's really interesting to see how those details are lost so quickly from a generation. And as part of that community that he thought, the clairvoyant thought should be wiped out, it's actually really unsettling and disturbing. So we need to open the doors of our houses of fiction that we construct and think, who's in those houses? Who's writing them? Who's building these houses? And we're on contested land if we're not Indigenous writers. How do we deal with that? We're on false foundations often. A lot of historians, of course, are doing brilliant work redressing that. A lot of Indigenous people, First Nations people, are there for us to listen and be incredibly generous, sharing their knowledge. And it's my responsibility as a non-Indigenous writer to deal with that problem. It's my problem. But I want to think about who's inside the houses of fiction, who's bashing down the walls and saying, I want to come in, or saying, actually, if you're the sort of people in this house, I'm going to go and build my own. Or as Toni Morrison said, if you haven't read a book that you relate to, you write your own. And so there's so much room now, which is a lovely thing about small presses like Wakefield Press, my wonderful press. And my original first book was The Floating Garden. And if I've got time, I'll quickly mention that was about the communities that were evicted for the building of the Sydney Harbour Bridge in the 1920s. And that story arose just from two facts from a dear friend of mine who said her grandmother's house had been had been demolished for the building of the bridge and was now underneath the North Pylon and Milson's Point. And so we're writing between the layers of history, ancient history and histories that have attempted to be concreted over, but still exist, and all the layers through. And the other fact she told me was her grandmother survived the Great Depression by selling homegrown flowers from a suitcase outside of Wynyard Station. So I had these two facts, two pylons, and I strung a little story arc between the two about the bridge, and with the wonderful Doric Black image on the cover, which some of you may know is in the Art Gallery of South Australia, where I spent a lot of my time at university being terribly shy and hiding in the gallery instead of trying to dare going into the refectory. So all these wonderful ideas can come together, and sometimes they turn into a compelling novel. There's a lot of false starts, a lot of false leads, but I'm a little bit addicted to it, which I'm sort of hearing maybe the other writers are saying too, because there's such a wonderful payoff when something works, or you find something new, or there's a serendipitous moment, or someone gives you a book or tells you about their grandmother or whatever it is. And I think there's a job for all of us to be thinking about our own histories and extrapolating out and seeing where they lead us. So I'm going to keep imagining and correcting and bringing into the light and including and searching and being just really in awe of how people in the past functioned and survived, and trying to honour the complexity of those stories and their strength.
Brilliant. Look, thank you very much, Emma. That's three great panelists bringing a really sort of three rich perspectives to this discussion. I really loved how you talked about like you're writing and you're thinking of a set for a film, and you're thinking about what matters to the audience and what do they need to know, how much do they need to know, and how do they understand this context, and that idea of all of your research and your ideas coming together to create this compelling story is yeah, fabulous. So what we're going to do now, we've got our panelists have all joined us, and We're going to jump straight to the Q&As, just because the audience have put some really deep thought into some of these questions, and we've obviously got a lot of passionate people in the audience. Now, we are almost at time, so for those that may need to leave us soon and go and cook dinner or whatever it might be that you're doing, I've noticed we've got someone from the UK, so they're probably having a cup of tea in the morning. But if you do need to leave us soon, remember this will be recorded, and you will get a chance to tune into the Q&A once we share that recording. So I'm going to start with, there are a few questions around gender. There were a lot of comments about there being strong female protagonists in the books, and you all talk about that. You talk about who writes the books, you know, who writes the sources, who builds the houses. We talk about all of this complexity in sort of bringing these stories together. And there's also, so there's two questions here. I'm going to kind of bring them together as a two-part question, because there's another question about then how does this all play out? You all speak about that link with contemporary society and the social outlooks today, and how do audiences understand this historical context, and how might it relate to today? So the first question is really about that sort of that feminist thread, or that strong female protagonist, and perhaps those voices that are missing from these other books and these other sources and stories. So Pip, there was a direct question to you, but I feel like it equally applies to all of our panelists. But did you always set out to tell these stories and have these really strong female protagonists, or did they develop as you did your research?
They developed as I did my research. So my main aim when I started was to put a girl in the context I was curious about and see what would happen. And we've all talked about the rabbit hole that you can go down when you start doing research. And, you know, like Victoria said, you go down rabbit holes and you notice a lot of detail along the way. It's the rabbit holes, and if you think of it like a map, it's the places that it takes me and the places I want to stop, that then help me to decide what detail I need. So for me, I was initially only interested in the Oxford English Dictionary, but once I started down that history rabbit hole, I realised that it tracked almost perfectly with the women's suffrage movement in the UK. I couldn't not write about the women's suffrage movement. And so all of a sudden I had some characters who were active in that movement, and who become important to Esme's life and to the story that I was telling. So that's an example, I suppose, of how the characters develop. And so, yeah, I think it can go both ways, but for me, it's reading the history and reading between the lines of the history that helped me to develop my characters.
Yeah, great. I mean, we had an author and historian, I believe, on last year who talked about, yeah, the lack of female voices in the historical record and in a lot of those sources. So reading between the lines and understanding what's not there and understanding the context in which these sources were constructed. Yeah. Victoria and Emma, I'm wondering if you have any, if you'd like to add anything to Pip.
I did always set out to write a kind of, I'm a proud feminist myself, and I always, that question to me is, what do we understand about the past that isn't true? And just as an example, in the when I wrote The Land Girls, I toured with that book, and I met a land girl who was 92. She was about 4 foot tall. She was the tiniest little thing. And she was just so great. I wish I'd met her during the research for the book, honestly. But I said to her, I asked her, because she came along to a session with her daughter, and I just basically gave her the microphone, Lil, her name was. And I said, when you finished being a land girl, did you go off and have children? And you know, the subtext was, were you one of those women who went home and did the 50s housewife thing? And she said, oh God, no. She said, we'd had two incomes. We wanted to build a house. It was much better to have two incomes in a house than one. And so I looked at the rates of working women in the workforce, because single women continue to work, of course, they didn't have to resign, but the rate of working women in the workforce after the war just continued to increase. So we have this idea from, I don't know, Happy Days or something, that women happily gave up their jobs and became little homemakers. Well, that actually is not the reality. And working class women have always worked. So I love excavating that. And so those things were really front of mind for me when I set out to write, so the women's pages and the land girls as well.
And if I could just say that there's a short story I wrote in my book called Silent Partner, which is set in contemporary times, but it really is based on an event that happened where I went to a cemetery to see my grandfather's grave, and in it was a name that I recognised of a family friend who used to run a farm, and we'd visit there as kids. And she was very thin and smoked really rolly thin cigarettes and stare at us kids, not particularly interested in us, and tell us to always shut the gates and get in and be quiet. And I noticed that she was actually buried next to a woman. And I said, "Wow, who's that?" And my mother said, "Well, that was her great friend." And so later, my aunt told me, well, actually, they were in a relationship. And I'd just been in Trove the other day looking them up. And they were actually written up in the paper for being it was called Women Bosses was the headline. And they ran that farm, and one of them was actually the first woman to be on the primary producers board. So we're talking about sort of the 30s and the 40s. And these are the sort of stories that don't get passed down. And maybe they were regarded as being unhappy spinsters. Well, it really couldn't be more from the case. From what my aunt said, they drank a lot of whiskey and had big parties. So, I mean, it's always lovely when you find these things that contradict or add to in a nice way, you know, like just breaking down those silences, I suppose. So I do deliberately go and think about those gaps, I suppose.
Can I just add something to what Victoria and Emma have said? And I think this as well. When you do delve into the history and read between the lines, often what you find are contradictions to the stereotype of women's lives in history. And historical fiction writers can sometimes be accused of overlaying modern sensibilities on their historical characters. And sometimes what I think is going on there is that readers have been fed a diet of stereotypes. And then when they read something that's contrary to the stereotype, but in fact, what we know through our research is actually historically true, they accuse you of modern, you know, overlaying modern sensibilities. And an example of this is, I mean, you know, the suffrage movement, I wonder what, you know, women have always been wanting the things we want today. They've expressed it differently, but we haven't changed. Humans haven't evolved for millennia. we still fear in the same way. We feel guilt in the same way. We love, we grieve. You know, these things are fundamental to who we are as humans, though they may manifest themselves slightly differently from culture to culture and time to time. We're not so different to our, you know, women 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago.
Absolutely. And then you think about that there were women in the French Revolution forming a women's movement.
Exactly.
1718. And so these are the things that you go, well, and there would have been something before that. And I'm not a historian, but you just come across these things. And even Hilary Mantel made something about recently, who I love, about, oh, everyone's writing empowered women. But then I think, well, what about Mary Wollstonecraft? You know, what about Harriet Tubman? I mean, these women were incredible and breaking barriers all the time. So, yeah.
Yes, very true. This is fabulous discussion. There's a question that's got quite a few upvotes in the Q&A, which ties in really nicely to this conversation. And I might just flip it a bit because it's from someone well known to the History Trust, a huge supporter, who's a historian, and I'm a historian. And the question is, because I think, yeah, there's some interesting things coming out in this discussion. So the question is about whether the rise of, or in the popularity of historical fiction, whether that's some kind of sad indictment on the traditional practice of history, But I think what you're all sort of saying is that fiction gives you that license to read between the lines, and there's another question in here actually that probably ties in a little too, which is around, does fiction give you an opportunity to tell some of those smaller stories and delve into the detail and those, especially of those people that don't make it to those official historical records? And is there real opportunity there to explore history in a different way? Because I don't think, I think they're not really in opposition to each other, but I'm wondering whether you can talk about that. You've all acknowledged that you're not historians, but as far as I can tell from your craft and the process of research, you ask a lot of the same questions, but you just have license to create a world and a story based on that is quite rich.
If I could start with just a very quick story. 2 weeks ago, I went to a high school, Hallett Cove. The teacher in the class and one of her colleagues had read The Land Girls over Christmas, and they thought it would be great for their students to study. And I went and talked to the Year 10 students, and it was the biggest thrill of my life. Because one, when I was at school in the 70s, we learnt about the Bushmen of the Kalahari. I didn't learn about Aboriginal people. And now these students are learning, and they had some really fantastic questions. And one, I was thrilled as an author, of course. But secondly, I thought if I had been their age and an author had walked into my classroom, I would have exploded, because that's what I wanted to do. So I think to the historian who asked the question, there's hope that some of these stories are being studied, and I think the history curriculum when I went to school, guess who wrote it? No surprise.
Look, I think we couldn't be doing this if we didn't have the historians' work. And I'm always conscious of how much, and I say I don't really read nonfiction. I spend all the time reading nonfiction, but I also read a lot of fiction. And so I think it's about just that idea of, I don't pretend to know how it is to be another person in the world. And so it's always useful to have more views, I think. And it really was, there was no books by women when I was at school. I'm probably the same age as you, Victoria. And we didn't have any books by women at all. And we had to come to do a final essay, and I chose to do Fitzgerald's Women because we'd all read The Great Gatsby. I don't even know why I thought of it, but I think I was grappling for some other voice and wondering where it was. And, So I think it's a really shared thing. And I think too, what happens, I read some historical fiction books. I actually go and I read Melissa Ashley's book. I go and actually look up the history about it. So I go back, you see, so it's a lovely loop.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I think it's horses for courses, essentially. I think some people will always turn to the historical texts to find out about something they're curious about. Other people will turn to fiction to read about something they're curious about, but as Emma said, might not find what they're looking for, and then they'll turn to the historical texts. As writers, we are never without the historians by our side, or we wouldn't be writing the fiction that we're writing. Certainly no one would believe it, because we wouldn't have that sort of authenticity that historical research provides, and not our historical research. But so Claire Wright, for instance, who's an Australian feminist historian, she writes about the women's suffrage movement in Australia and women who travelled overseas to sort of support the British and the English suffrage movement. Without her historical research, I wouldn't have had I wouldn't have known, for instance, about Muriel Matters. Without seeing her talk at Writers' Week, I wouldn't have known about Muriel Matters and been interested in her in terms of her role. And she gets this little cameo in my novel because of that. Now, I'm hoping that people who've read my novel now know who Muriel Matters is.
Yeah.
They now know that South Australia was the first place in the world that had full enfranchisement for women, not just the vote. Women could actually also run for Parliament. Without the historians, our fiction wouldn't have the depth that it does. And I think that we work as a multidisciplinary team in a way. We have different skills, different curiosities, and we present things differently, but it's all there on offer.
And there's also the idea too, and I did a bit just quickly, that you have to do something with these pieces of information, whether you're a historian, and I've been just a research assistant gathering information that someone puts into a narrative, but you've got to do a narrative with it. It has to be, you have to do something. You do sorting and sifting, and there's a word emplotment, which sounds very, whatever, but it's about giving a plot a shape to it. And I think we're all trying to give something a shape to whatever we're writing, to make it something people can absorb.
Yes. Oh, look, I couldn't agree more. Thank you all for those. We're getting a lot of really great comments in the chat. Everyone is really enjoying this. We are going to run out of time. I'm going to ask one more question if all three of you are happy to stick around for another couple of minutes. Just want to ask one more question which kind of ties in nicely to this discussion. And then what we might do for the audience is call on you to answer some of these other questions offline if you have time, and we'll circulate them when we circulate the recording. I think it's been a rich discussion and people have all sorts of great but detailed questions which would see us here for another hour otherwise. But so thinking about the practice of a historian and then a writer, and how you draw on these sources and these people to create these worlds. So there's been a couple of questions I've seen around are there sort of legal or ethical or moral considerations when you might use a real person in historical fiction? I mean, how do you approach that?
Could I answer that? I do. I had that moral dilemma the entire time I was writing my book. So my book is based on a couple of key fictional characters, but the supporting cast are all real people. Now, I wasn't so worried about how I wrote about the majority of them, including James Murray and various lexicographers and James Murray's daughters who worked at the scriptorium as well. But the dilemma I had was how I wrote about one woman whose name is Edith Thompson. She was a volunteer. She's one of the people that sent in words and how they were used. And she worked on the dictionary from A to Z. So 40 years of her life she dedicated to the dictionary. But if you look her up in the history books, you'll find about a paragraph or two about her. And that's only because she herself was a historian and wrote about her grandfather, who was a British parliamentarian. So that's why we know about her. Her sister, who was also a volunteer, we know nothing about her particularly. But my dilemma was I turned her into a character who becomes Esme, who's fictional, becomes her godmother. Now, all of their interactions are fictional because by nature of that relationship. And I debated long and hard about whether to give her a pseudonym. And in the end, just decided I didn't want to take her name away from her and take her out of the text again. And so I leave her with her name, Edith Thompson, particularly when I'm writing about her role with the dictionary. But when she's in conversation or writing letters to Esme, she has a nickname, which is Dita, which is fictional. And that's a nickname that the fictional character gives her. And that's how I dealt with that. But it was a dilemma because I didn't want to leave her out again, even though I was taking liberties with her life.
Yeah, it's interesting that idea of inclusion and you're going to make them absent twice. It's and the book I'm writing now is actually about the missing portrait of my ancestor who was born enslaved on a Caribbean sugar plantation. So I'm obviously a white Australian, but I have an African heritage which has only been recently discovered. So there's a whole lot of issues there about who am I and what am I doing writing this story, etc., etc. And I tend to avoid real people in mind, but in my novel The Floating Garden I talk about the theosophists like Annie Besant, who came out to Australia, and I invented one that was a little bit based on her. So I sort of did the coward way out, Pip, and sort of invented, but I thought, well, there would be people modelling themselves on her, and there were. So that was one way to sort of avoid that whole, but to reference her but not actually create her as and it allowed me just to run with the idea of who this woman was rather than spending another X months researching So I think there's a really big moral. I think also that, I think about if someone starts writing about your family, do you actually want them to? I mean, and if it's, I think it's, and I've worked on both sides, so I've done history, looking things up, and the other side, and I think, well, sometimes maybe I wouldn't. So it's a really moral question. I think we have to keep asking ourselves. Yeah.
And that's the thing. I think you just have to keep asking it, and then you need to be able to honestly justify it to yourself and others, I suppose. But you need to be comfortable with the decision.
Yeah, I hadn't faced this dilemma in the women's pages or the Land Girls or the last of the Bonagilla Girls. I created all those characters because those events were kind of big. I mean, I could create a newspaper and I could create a journalist. But the book I've just submitted, which will be out next year, is about a real World War I hospital staffed by Australians in Middlesex. And the first 5 nurses helped establish the hospital. And I wanted to write about them. But do you know there's not even a list of the nurses who worked at that hospital in the Army record, in the Defence Force records? So that was one part. So I didn't want to create their lives, recreate their lives without knowing them. But I also for fictional reasons wanted to have characters to do things for the narrative. And this is what we were talking about. That truth does sometimes get in the way of good fiction. So, but partly it was because there's nothing. So I created 4 characters because 5's a little unwieldy, and I've created their backstories, and I did struggle with that actually, and it's something I will, as you did, Pip, in your sort of author's note at the end of the Dictionary of Lost Words, I'll be very careful to make the point and name those nurses. I don't think we even know their first names, just their first names. So and I found that to me was the big. It was a moral dilemma actually. Yeah.
Right. Look, thank you all very much. We do need to wrap up. Some people are having to leave us, but I think you've all demonstrated, I think as someone said in the chat just now, demonstrated in spades the real integrity you bring to this process, which is fabulous and comforting. So look, thank you again, Pip, Victoria and Emma, and thank you also to Catherine and Britt behind the scenes who have this is the most technical problems we've had ever on Talking History, and they've made it work seamlessly. So thank you so much to Catherine and Britt as well.
Thanks, Catherine and Britt.
Thank you, Catherine and Britt, for bearing fruit.
Great. So I'm just going to give a quick plug to our next session. We've got our next Talking History is a special in-person event for South Australia's History Festival 2021. It's called Building a Democracy, South Australia's First 4 Premiers, and it'll be on Monday the 17th of May at 1:30 p.m. Now, it is almost sold out. The History Festival program was launched only days ago. The event is almost sold out, but rest assured we'll be just like these sessions, we will be recording. So go and sign up to the mailing list or follow us on Facebook. And you can get a copy of that recording. You can also add yourself to the wait list on Eventbrite, and if a seat becomes available, you'll be able to attend in person. But it will be recorded and it will be released. And just like this session, now we do have a lot of questions that didn't get answered tonight, so hopefully we can work with our panelists to answer a few more of those. I think it's been a really fabulous discussion. I think that's really it, and thank you very much to the audience who have tuned in from near and far, and who have kept the chat lively and asked really great questions as always. So thank you all, and good night or good morning.